Hey, talking with God about kings and kingdoms. This week, talking heads, and we're in 2 Samuel chapter 1. Come on in, let's check it out.
All the Bubbas of the world, we got one mission in mind.
Welcome to the Biblical Channel. Always glad you're showing up. Or at least a few of you are, and that's cool by me, man, because I just like talking about God, and I have found that talking about God rings my chamois out and everybody else's chamois out to to get the most out of this life. And while the Bible might be considered to be hard reading, it's really not that hard if we just read it with the right attitude. It's not hard to work out how brilliant it is and always has been, and why everybody ought to read it and everybody ought to be included and everybody ought to get great satisfaction out of it, and how it never, puts us at odds with anybody else. It actually makes us the happiest, kindest, most gentlest people, most caring people on the planet. And, that has been the proven track record of Christianity. Sorry, everybody, for, to ruin your parade, but Christianity has had the best track record of a group of people than anybody. I'm in, baby. I wasn't always in, but now I'm in. And that's because it's just the right side. I love being on the right side. Anyhow, that is not to make sides. That is just simply to invite all who want to come in. So part of the way that we want to invite all to come in is by examining the text on their own. And I always want people to just look at the text and see what you see. And you should be able to see what I'm saying, and with ease, really. Just read it, see what I'm saying. But I just like talking about it. We're not going to read the whole thing, by any means. We'll read here and there, but we will get a sense of what's going on as we open up the book of 2 Samuel. So anyhow, here at the Biblical Channel, we just have fun talking about God. We are trying to get all of ourselves from the bullshit to the holy shit so that we can shoot the shit and sound like we're knowing our shit. That's kind of our motto: to rejoice always, to pray continually, to give thanks in all circumstances. That is the will of God. That's what he says. So let's stick with that. Anywho, 2 Samuel, we open up the scene. 1 Samuel ends with Saul is dead. And most of 1 Samuel was really about Saul. And here, it is going to turn the spotlight to David in God's big epic story. Now, don't forget, Saul was part of God's epic story. Saul was God's intentional choice for Israel and their times, to give them an object lesson, to help them to see through some of their errors. Saul was the tall, dumb, and handsome one, which is oftentimes the substance of our leadership and really what we want. And we ourselves are guilty of not wanting more out of government. And so anyhow, that's part of the lesson. And we're also guilty of not wanting God in our government. And that is just a huge, colossal mistake, because God is the government, really at the end of it. If there is a God, then he is the government. And we would be wise to try to think of something far bigger than ourselves, and that puts us right into God's lap. And right into God's lap is where God wants us, by the way. So that's a good thing, because he is our Father who is in heaven. Hallowed be his name, his kingdom come. You know how the prayer goes that Jesus taught us. But anyhow, the spotlight turns to David. David is over in Ziklag. I don't know where Ziklag is. You probably don't either, unless you took a tour of Israel somehow. And the spotlight was on Gilboa beforehand. Those are two separate places. You don't need to know where they are. It's just that they're two separate places. Saul dies on the hill of Gilboa, and David is fighting his own battles over in Ziklag, trying to rescue the family, which is successful, and everything's gone well there, but we're in two different places. So that sets up our scene for this messenger. An Amelekite comes from Saul's camp, comes from where Saul's died, and comes right up to David, and that's where we are. I've titled this Talking Heads, number one, because I love the Talking Heads. David Burns and the Talking Heads have produced some of the best music ever, and I think about David Burns and the Talking Heads a lot. Famous sayings came from the Talking Heads, like "stop making sense," which is, well, funny. And then there's also Same as It Ever Was, and he did that thing. If you were MTV, fans, and you watched the videos, he tapped his arm and said, "Same as it ever was." Now that was funny too. Now, talking heads also spills us into the reality of our story here. We have three talking heads. We have the narrator, who is the first talking head telling the story. And then we have the Amelekite, who is going to have a lot to say. And then there's David, who is going to be and frame up our third talking head. And we will then end by wondering, well, what would the fourth talking head say? Let's hold our thoughts and get right to business. Back to David. He's on Ziklag. He's over there in Ziklag. And this young Amelekite comes, huffing and puffing. And not only is he huffing and puffing, he is, he has the garb of sadness on. He is in open lament. He has the ashes and sackcloth on, and he comes to find David. And he finds David. And when he finds David, he has a lot to say. Anyhow, where we are is these, talking heads give shape to our passage. And so the first talking head is the narrator. And the narrator is telling us, the story at the end of 1 Samuel, and the narrator is telling us a story in the beginning of 2 Samuel. So it's the same, it's the same voice coming through telling us the story. We have to remember that because something interesting is going to happen here. The Amelekite, when he gets to David, he seems to be really distraught over Saul's death. And David is, warm to receive him, and is sad to hear the news. And he asks, the young man, "Well, how did it go? I mean, how do you know that Saul was there?" And this is where the story gets a little weird, because the young man who had told him that Saul was dead said, "Well, this is how it went. I saw Saul leaning on a spear, and behold, chariots and horsemen were close upon him, and he looked behind him, and he saw me, and he called to me. And I answered, 'Hey, I'm an Amelekite.' And he said, 'Well, stand beside me and kill me, for anguish has seized me, and yet my life still lingers.' So I stood there beside him, and I killed him," says the Amelekite, "because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen," meaning that his battle wounds were too great. So I went ahead and did what he told me to do. I went ahead and took his crown, and I took his armlet, and I have brought them to you, my lord." Now, the story, seems, pretty innocent and pretty sweet to some degree, except that the narrator already told us how Saul died. That Saul fell on his spear, that there was no Amalekite involved, that he saw the Amalekites, he saw the Philistines crashing in around him, and he asked his armor bearer to do the deed. His armor bearer declined, so he falls on his sword, and the armor bearer takes his own life as well. Very sad ending to that story. Now comes an Amalekite with a little different version, and oddly enough, the version that the Amalekite tells puts himself in a pretty admirable spot, or at least so he thinks, right? He thinks that he's done the humane thing. He thinks he's done a good thing. He's brought the crown and the armlet to David. It seems like he expects maybe a favor in return. And if that's the way you're thinking, then you are hearing the narrator clearly. As you listen to the young man coming to David, it's all sounds innocent until it doesn't, and then it doesn't, and because it's not. Okay, David takes a hold of his own clothes and he tears them, and he puts on his own ashes and sackcloth, and he openly laments for Saul. And as he openly laments for Saul, he also has just heard that Jonathan has died as well. And so David is in anguish because Jonathan is his best friend of all time. And, perhaps friends with benefits, as some would say. It doesn't matter, though, that, David is actually struck with grief over Jonathan's death and Saul's death. Not quite sure how, deeply affected by Saul's death he is, but he's definitely deeply affected by Jonathan's death. And so David then turns to the young Amalekite and says, hey, how is it that you were not afraid to put out your hand to the Lord's anointed? And so he tells one of his own men, he said, execute him. Because, he should have known better. Blood be on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you. So clearly this did not go the way the young Amalekite thought. And for our modern 21st century hearers, we hear this and it's troubling. And if you hear it and it's a little troubling, I think that's exactly where the text would have you. Except remember this, though. Here's an interesting perspective. There are very few cultures in the world, even today, that would hear this story and think that the Amalekite was treated unjustly. And if you went back 100, 200 years, it would be harder and harder to find anybody who had any emotional concern for the Amalekite. The times are different. And why are the times different? And let me just lay it on the line. The times are different because of Jesus Christ. If you're feeling this overwhelming sense of injustice to the Amalekite, believe me, the narrator has presented these facts in a way that he doesn't mind if you do. And maybe David is not just in his action. He does not seek God's advice here. So, but if you find, like I said, any other culture just sees this as the normal transaction, like that this guy took a risk by doing what he did, and he came on the wrong side of it. The risk did not pay off. And I don't really think there's any culture really that holds David in contempt for this, because, well, it's just the way life goes. You took a very risky moment. You threw the dice and you lost. And so the Amalekite loses. So for those of us in the 21st century that have this enormous sympathy for injustice, you have to remember that this enormous sympathy for, the victim, in this case, the enemy, in this case, the Amalekite, the Philistine, who is, under the judgment of God. If you have those sympathies, that has come from a Christian worldview. 2,000 years of the Christian worldview has produced in humanity a more and more sympathetic humanity. You don't find this kind of sympathetic humanity coming from the other continents, or, from the other cultures in the other continents, i.e. Africa, i.e. Asia, really anywhere. But you do find this kind of concern coming from Christianity. So oddly enough, if you're mad about the text, the narrator has you kind of where he expects you to be. Because David himself is not the hero. God is the hero. God is putting together a story, and he is the fourth talking head in this story. And so you will have to, keep reading. And if you've already read 2 Samuel or you have some memories of 2 Samuel, you should remember or know that in the future David is going to ask God, or he's going to tell God that he's going to build a temple for God. And God's going to intervene and say, no, you're not, because you have too much blood on your hands. You see, David is not perfect. He's not the hero. He is full of character flaws. And is David right to kill this Amalekite? Is not told to us by the narrator, is not told to us by God. And the only consolation that there could be is that the whatever injustice that happens here goes before a very just God, and he straightens out the mess on the other side of death. Friends, I will just say that is for all of us. That message is for all of us. Whatever sense of injustice that we find in our friends and loved ones' deaths, whether it's a disease that takes them too short, an accident that takes them too short, or anything, or another person that takes their lives, from our perspective, too short. Well, that is, the concern of this text is that God is the only one that can straighten out the messes that are in this broken world. And it's to him that we should go. Okay. So let us now turn to David, the talking head, because David is now going to, pour out this wonderful elegy, not a eulogy, but an elegy. An elegy is more of a lament that includes, some complaintive information, as well as some, landmark information, as well as an explanation, and includes some eulogizing as well. But this is an elegy that David puts together. And, so anyhow, David goes on an elegy campaign. I imagine some time has gone by. David stands forward in the front of a congregation of people, but he makes sure that this speech that he gives is to be taught to the generations of Israel. He is lamenting a lamentation, which is an elegy. And it is to be written in this book of Jashar. Also, side note on the book of Jashar. The book of Jashar has been out of print. We don't have it. Don't know where it is. But it gives us clear evidence, because the book of Jashar is mentioned in Joshua as well as a holding place of the records of Israel. And so we get a sense that this culture that is Israel is in the habit of writing down their stories. And then as they write their stories down, they put them back together again in the form of another story. That's what we have going on here in First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings. It's all putting together, and I suspect it is the process of getting rid of some of these, smaller fragmented documents that were holding information together and putting the information in the story down into a faithful subscription or into a faithful rendition. And when it comes to that, this is God's process for creating his words. He chooses faithful people. So most likely the keepers of the book of Jashar are the group called the prophets that we've run into time and time again already in the storyline, that there is a group out there that are called the prophets, and prophesying biblically is really just speaking the words of God accurately. Being prophetic, simply means to just say God's words about God faithfully and out loud, and to make sure that people are on the course of knowing God as God has described himself. That is the role of the prophets. And so the prophets, are the gatekeepers of the written record as well. And so, what we have here is mentioned that there is other literature. It's not important for us to have the book of Jashar because the faithful community of the prophets have reworked it all into a storyline. But that brings us to another interesting point, that this is a very strange story to begin the spotlight on David. This is the kind of story that kind of makes your head scratch and say, why would you start off this kind, with this kind of story? It's an odd story. And I think the only explanation is this. It's real. It easily, if I was writing the Bible, I would have chopped this out of here. But the faithful community that put together all of the pages of the Bible, whether you're the apostles around Jesus or whether you're the prophets of old, both groups tell it like it is, and they don't church it up, meaning they leave the warts and the awkwardness and the oddities in there because they have a purpose called reality. The Bible is not a document written in unreality or fantasy. The Bible is a document written in reality. And so this story brings the story and keeps the story right on earth as it belongs. and that God is the fourth talking head in all of this, because this story God will use. Number one, he uses this story to give an early indication, a foreshadowing, that while David is a man after his own heart and a great guy, and, a picture of faith in many ways, he's also a very flawed character, and we are right to wonder if David was right in killing this Amalekite, even in an ancient context where nobody would have doubted David's, motives. We are reminded time and time again that David has a bit of a short fuse, that David's emotions get ahead of himself, even when he is being faithful. I think David is acting out of what he perceives as being faithful to God in this episode, but yet it doesn't make him right. But his elegy is really worth our paying attention to. Number one, I think it gives us a clear picture on grief, on how to grieve for loved ones and important people and just people in general. That as we grieve, it's totally appropriate to lament. And so David starts off this elegy, "Your glory, O Israel, is slain in your high places." And then he very pointedly, says, "Don't tell this in Gath." What's he mean by that? Well, the Philistines are in Gath, and most likely the Philistines, are having a real, mug slamming moment, saying, "We've defeated those Israelites. Good for us." And David says, don't tell them of the great and glorious people of Saul and Jonathan. Don't tell them at all. Don't talk to them at all, which is a bit opposite from, our idea of evangelizing, people in all nations that Jesus, brings us to. But it is appropriate in the face of, wrong that has been done, to bring together death, especially the death of a loved one, and the judgment that God promises, in it all. And so David is dabbling here with combining death and judgment together. He memorializes Gilboa. He curses Gilboa because, it's kind of like remember the Alamo. The Alamo was really a curse, with the death and the slaying of all 100 and some guys at the hands of Santa Anna. And, and so it's memorialized. So David is saying, you mountains of Gilboa, may rain and dew never fall on you. So he's pronouncing this curse over the scene, but he's also calling for a permanent remembrance of the fact that the mighty have fallen on this mountain, and that Saul himself was not able to be anointed with oil before his death. Okay, so this is the substance of elegy. And then David moves to, elegize not only Saul and even Jonathan, but all of those who have been slain in the battles that have taken place. And then David turns his attention on Saul and Jonathan. And it's very interesting when David says, Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely. Once again, that catches us because we're thinking to ourselves, really? I don't know that Saul was really, he's so problematic that, it's surprising that David is speaking so well of him. But David is keeping it classy. And everybody knows that when somebody dies, pretty much their sins and their wrongs are now forgotten. Pericles picked up on this in the mid 600 BCs, and he gets a lot of credit for talking about this, that those who are fallen in battle especially, it doesn't matter what sins or what, atrocities they committed before in their lives. It's all forgotten once they die in battle, because now we just remember them in glory. And then we really do that with people, all of the people in our lives, that we remember them in their glory. And that is keeping it classy. And that is the right thing to do. And that's what David is doing. You daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, clothe yourselves in scarlet and put ornaments of gold on your apparel, in remembrance of Saul, the king of Israel. And so David is keeping the spotlight rightfully on the fact that God chose Saul for a reason, and Saul should be rightfully memorialized and remembered correctly. Then he turns to Jonathan, who is his nearest and best friend. Jonathan lies in your high places, and I am distressed for you, Jonathan, my brother. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of a woman. David and Jonathan were close, man. And it is appropriate to, say loving things, the eulogy, so to speak, to say, keep it classy and keep people remembering the most important things. And then he ends by saying how the mighty have fallen and the weapons of war perished. Now, let's go back to the fourth talking head, and that is God. And this is what makes the God book that we call the Bible so extraordinary. The God book that we call the Bible is a document that if you literally pick up where the pen begins, which is Moses, and go to Jesus Christ and his apostles, which is 2,000 years ago, that time period is right about 1,500 years. If you want to include Abraham, in that, then it's 2,000 years. But this is a storyline in its narrative form that begins, with the pen of Moses and is now continuing with a prophetic pen that we don't know the author of here, but will continue through the prophets all along. The storyline is going to hold together in a way that is surprising, to say the least, because the storyline is held together in a great reversal of our own ideas. And what I mean by that is God takes the worst moments of life and he makes it about finding the best. And so this story right here, or this elegy that David proclaims, if you went back and thought about, so here we have, from David's point of view, calling Israel and their glory to recognize that their beloved has been slain in high places. And think about the story of Jesus Christ that will close, the storyline that God has put together. David is certainly not, Saul is certainly not, future characters, future kings of Israel are certainly not the man that is going to save the world that Eve, back in Genesis chapter 3, indicates is coming. Remember, Eve indicates that there is a son of hers that is coming forward that will crush the head of evil. Here, it is not David. David makes that clear, and David's, slaying and shedding of blood makes that clear. But Jesus will be the high point of God's story. And the high point of God's story is actually Jesus being put to death wrongfully as well. And so God takes an ignominious death of Jesus, the Son of God, God himself, and he turns it into the salvation of the world. All of the world's injustices are felt and experienced by God on another hill, the hill of the skull, the hill of Golgotha, not Gilboa, but Golgotha. And indeed, God's glory is called to be seen and recognized by everyone. And the invitation that Jesus makes in that is, come one, come all. If you are on Asia's continent, come. If you're on Africa's continent, come. If you're in Europe's continent, come. If you're in the Americas continents, come. If you're in the Arctics, come. Come one, come all. That is the message. And these words right here can fit easily into the future of the most famous of God's fallen in the high places, and that is Jesus Christ, who takes something so dark and brings the world to light. That's where we'll end our time. Talking Heads.